Warning: the following podcast might be too truthful for most liberals. Listener discretion is therefore advised.
Welcome to the Tea Party Power Hour. This is your host, Mark Galar. Today, my guest is Jeffrey Paul. He is a research professor in the Social Philosophy Center of the John Chambers College of Business and Economics at West Virginia University. He's here today to talk to us about his book, Winning America's Second Civil War. Jeffrey, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. This is a very interesting topic. I do want to say one thing before we dig into the book in earnest, and that is the title, Winning the Second Civil War. If people are tuning in thinking that this is a military strategy book on how someone can actually win a second civil war with bullets and so forth, that's not what this is about. And I say that only because in the crazy world that we live in, Jeffrey, Merrick Garland could send the FBI to either of our front doors and arrest us for sedition if we're not careful with this. But I'm joking about that, but then again, there are probably some people would say we're not too far off with that. Now back to the book. There's so much craziness going on around us, and I'm sure, given your line of work as a college professor, you probably have a lot of anecdotal examples about the wokeness on campus. And I think a lot of people would be surprised that the roots of this go back many, many decades. And something that you've pointed out that I haven't heard anyone else point out is the connection between where we are today and the German professors who came to teach in America decades ago, and some of the Americans who went to Germany to be educated. They've been at this for a long time. Tie that all together for us.
Yeah, the country did an about-face without recognizing that was taking place in the last quarter of the 19th century. It happened out of sight of the population of the United States, out of the view of newspapers, journalists, etc. And what happened was, if we go back to the country's founding was a singularity in world history. That is, it was founded on principles that had never been identified and invoked before and haven't been invoked since. And those principles were that individual human beings have a right of self-ownership. That's what the founders meant by the right to life. They got it from an English philosopher, John Locke, and he became the major figure in the views of the pre-founders and then the founders of the United States. So the United States was founded on the principle that all previous governments in the United States, this was an implication, this was what was implied by it, going back 5,000 years to recorded history, were illegitimate because they were all autocracies of one kind or another, mostly theological autocracies in which the governor had the privilege of effectively owning everyone else whom he governed. There were no restrictions on what he could do unless there were some kind of formal restrictions, but it wasn't as if you were violating some law of nature, which is how the founders viewed this right, this central right, the right of self-ownership, from which it follows that individuals have a right of liberty not to be coerced by any other human being, or including the governors of a society, and also a right to the fruits of their labor. And indeed, from this view, they took the view, again from Locke, that individuals were perfectly free to stay out of governed societies and defend themselves, but that it was probably inefficient to do so. and therefore they could coalesce with other human beings who recognized these rights, who understood them, and create an institution to protect them. That institution would be a government restricted to being a security agency, really, one that was devoted to the protection of its citizens and their rights. And so that was the view that led to the Revolutionary War, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Northwest Ordinance, and so on. The result of that view was that the founders recognized that they themselves had embraced an institution which directly violated these rights, and that was the institution of slavery. That's why the first Civil War, what I call the first Civil War, the Civil War from 1861 to 1865, was an inevitability after this founding. And there was a verbal dispute over the institution of slavery from the founding to the Civil War. It became very intense from 1820 to 1860, but the final resolution had to be a military one because there was no way the southern states were going to give up this institution, and therefore it had to be resolved by military means. The irony is that within 10 to 15 years after that battle for these fundamental rights, which made the United States unique, there was an about-face which took place out of this view, out of the sight of most Americans within American colleges. And the other thing that's interesting is that this about-face occurred by accident. The presidents of the major American colleges wanted to transform their institutions from teaching institutions, pedagogical institutions like high schools, into research institutions as they are today. That is, ones in which research would be conducted in the sciences, engineering, medicine, etc. And the only country which had such institutions was Germany. It had had institutions like that for 200 years at that point. And so the presidents of the major colleges, starting with Columbia and Johns Hopkins, which was a newly created university in 1876, decided that they would hire a graduate faculty that could do research and assign doctorates to its graduate students. He was to get them from Germany, not Germans, but Americans trained in Germany. And they came over, and in the sciences, this was an extraordinary triumph. Mathematics, physics, biology, chemistry, astronomy, etc., made an enormous leap forward as a result of the training that the Americans had absorbed in Germany. But the social sciences and the humanities, it was a catastrophe.
Right.
And it was a catastrophe that took place out of sight, out of the view of most Americans. What happened was that the Germans held a view that was the antithesis, the opposite, direct opposite of the American view. And that was that nations are like organisms, and human beings aren't independent entities. They are the cellular components of the organism. And like the cells in a human body and like the organs in a human body, they have one function: to preserve the body, to preserve the person, to preserve the organism. And that was the conception of the citizenry in Germany. And the idea was that they had no rights, only duties to to sustain the life of the organism, the nation, and those particular duties were to be assigned to them by the organism's brain, comprised of the faculty at the universities and their students in the government bureaucracy. That view was the view that the Americans brought with them, and it was the view that in Germany led within 50 years to National Socialism, Nazism in Germany. In the United States, the social scientists and humanities professors decided to disguise their views from the public by calling themselves, naming themselves something other than what they would have been called in Germany. In Germany, they were known as state socialists, which was a good term. In the United States, socialist was not a good term. They could not have gotten hired. They could not have been, their institutions would not have received funding from donors. The presidents wouldn't have hired them. The trustees wouldn't have enabled the hiring of them. So they called themselves, they chose a term from one of the German political parties, the German Progress Party, and called themselves progressives. That's where the name comes from. It was basically, like I said, the same view on the same trajectory as that would eventuate in Nazism in Germany. And the first faculty laid out its agenda for the country. First, it wanted an income tax. The United States had only had an income tax as an emergency measure during the Civil War. It never had another income tax. It passed one that was found unconstitutional in 1894. Second, they wanted a fourth branch of government that could make rules that would effectively be laws without being elected. They would be a bureaucracy. And so all the bureaucracies that we have today, which didn't exist before 1880 in the United States, were results of that view. And then finally, they outright explicitly argued for the philosophy that I've outlined here, in contrast to the natural rights view, and they attacked natural rights repeatedly. They had more in common with the defeated Confederacy than they did with the victorious North. And so the country, out of sight, had these colleges which became universities and which in the 20th century educated increasingly from generation to generation enormous numbers of students, which they didn't have in the 19th century. And those students spilled into various professions. First of all, journalism. And they transformed journalism into replicas of what was at the universities. And that started in the teens, went on in the 20s. By the 30s and 40s, the majority of working journalists were progressives, and they had to conform at the time to the views of the owners of newspapers, who were for the most part adherents of the founding principles. After World War I, Germany became viewed in the United States with anywhere from skepticism by Americans to outright hatred by Americans because of the First World War, because they felt the First World War was completely unnecessary, that it was a German creation. Therefore, the term that they had taken from Germany to characterize themselves, progressives, they had to find a substitute term. And the term they borrowed, which had good connotations, but the opposite meaning from what they actually, how they defined themselves, was the word liberal. And they began to use it in the teens and 20 sporadically, but it came into almost universal use during the New Deal, which characterized itself as liberal. Now, there's an irony about that because there was a book written by one of the original progressives in journalism who became probably the most famous columnist in the United States. His name was Walter Lippmann. Everyone on the liberal side of things assumed he was in their that he adhered to their views, which he had adhered to their views, until he came out with a book called The Good Society in 1937 during the New Deal, and he characterized the New Deal as fascist, as an emulation of Mussolini's Italy. And liberals were shocked. They were stunned by this. This was written by one of their own, and they were just puzzled, humiliated, etc. But it didn't change the trajectory that they were on. And that period, the New Deal, was one in which, although there were progressives in both parties, they had invaded both parties that elected one of their own, an academic, Woodrow Wilson, as president in 1912, after he'd been president of Princeton and governor of New Jersey. But the trajectory that they were on, which Lippmann identified, was a fascist trajectory. They didn't characterize themselves as that. They disguised their views, continued to do so, and with a monopoly on teaching social sciences and humanities in the colleges and universities, which had spread from the elite universities to the non-elite universities, and became basically the political character of virtually all universities and colleges in the United States. They became one-party institutions. And then surveys were taken beginning in the 1950s of faculty political opinion. And to no one's surprise who read any of these studies, that's exactly what they found. They found the majority of faculty at virtually every university in the country were liberal and members of the Democratic Party. And that, for the period of the 1950s, when it was originally discovered in these surveys that they were the vast majority of faculty, that's gotten worse and worse over decade. So many surveys have been taken now that they're basically secular churches for American liberalism and the Democratic Party. And just like the media which they created, the contemporary media which they created, they're basically an adjunct of the Democratic Party in the United States. That's bringing things up to date.
Is there any way we can ever retake that ground, so to speak, or is it pretty much lost forever?
I wouldn't say that it's lost forever, but here's what I would say. I would say that there is an immediate danger now. I think there is genuinely an immediate danger. I think this will be the most important election in the nation's history. It will finally resolve the question of whether we are going to emulate Germany and what happened in Germany in the early 1930s when an autocratic party was elected and had the plurality of legislatures in the legislators in the Reichstag, the German legislature, which enabled Hitler to become chancellor of Germany, and then with the death of their president von Hindenburg to become the Führer. The Republicans have to win this November. That doesn't mean things will dramatically change for the better. Things will certainly be a lot better than if the Democrats win. But if the Democrats win, in my view, they will transform the system into effectively a one-party system, not in name, but they will use all means, as they are using against Trump now, to preserve their majorities. Any means they can, however nefarious they are, however criminal they are, they will use, and they've shown that they're willing to do that, and that's what they want to do. I mean, basically, you have two views of governing that are irreconcilable. One has to prevail over the other. You can't have what the founders had and have what the Germans gave to Americans, as I said, out of sight of most Americans. So I think that's the immediate problem. The immediate problem will be resolved by this election coming in November. Libertarians, for example, should not be naive about this election and should not look at Trump superficially. They should understand what is at stake with this election. And it's the country and it's their liberty that's at stake. Whatever liberty they have now, they will sacrifice if they vote for some candidate, waste their vote on some candidate who has no chance of winning. And I say this as one who's been a libertarian since 1962, and one of his closest friends, one of my closest friends, was the first candidate from the Libertarian Party. I remember when it was created. John Hospers, who was chairman of the philosophy department at the University of Southern California, was the first candidate, and we had exactly the same views, and I didn't vote for him because I felt my vote would have been wasted in either case. It would have been clearly symbolic, and it wouldn't have taken us in any sort. I think there is a danger. So the first thing that has to be done is prevent the Democratic Party from becoming a one-party, from transforming the United States into a one-party system. And I might add one other thing.
Sure.
For anyone who thinks I'm exaggerating here, I'm being hyperbolic. One of the major liberal columnists, maybe the most important liberal columnist in the United States, is the New York Times' Tom Friedman. Tom Friedman wrote in 2009, 15 years ago, the United States needed to emulate China and become a one-party system. And the party he wanted was the Democratic Party. He saw the Republican Party only as an obstruction to the Democrats' plans, which he allied himself with, and he advocated explicitly exactly what I've said will eventuate if the Democratic Party wins this election in November. So that's the first thing. For the medium term, I think the second thing would be to reform the tax system. There should never have been an income tax in the United States in the first place. An income tax is a tax upon income. And so it's a tax effectively of those who depend upon income, not those who depend upon wealth, which comes from appreciated gains, unrealized capital gains, but from income. There are some people who become wealthy from extraordinarily high incomes, like entertainers, professional athletes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But most people become wealthy because they've created an enterprise which is unique and appreciates in value dramatically. By taxing income, there's a burden placed on the middle class, which keeps them dependent upon the government, which is exactly the intention. It was the intention of the people who devised the income tax in the academy. I'm not saying outside of the academy, but within the academy. So that has to be replaced. And I advocate that it should be replaced by what I call a universal sales tax, not a consumption tax, not a retail sales tax, but a 1% tax on all transactions, all sales of any object or service, whatever, including stocks, bonds, and derivatives. And what we found, and I worked with 3 economists on this for 2 years, what we found is that such a system will outraise the current tax system, which can be entirely replaced by this one tax. Most of the money would come from the sales of stocks, bonds, and derivatives, 9/10 of the money, and it would exceed what the government now collects with a present system of a personal income tax, a payroll tax, personal payroll tax, a corporate income tax, the profits tax, and the corporate payroll tax. Replace all of those, replace the capital gains tax with, there would be a 0 capital gains tax and a 0 estate tax. The economy would explode in the United States under such a system, and the middle class would be vastly relieved. They wouldn't have to file income taxes. They would be taxed every time they expended money. So that's for the medium term. For the long term, and the reason why I say that's for the medium term, it will not only make the American people prosperous, but in addition, it will make the party that opposes that a minority party for a long period of time. And then there'll be an opportunity to enact major reforms, reducing dramatically the 4th branch of government, the administrative branch. Second of all, attempting to reform education. And that would involve withdrawing all federal grants of whatever kind and whatever purpose to universities, all of them, ending the Department of Education and withdrawing all funds going to universities, state or private. Then second, doing what states like Florida, Ohio, and several other states are doing, North Carolina, by establishing new departments of civic studies. They're called different things, which are not incorporated in or under the governance of present departments in political science, history, etc., but are in effect a second liberal arts college without the sciences, but only the social sciences and the humanities, and filling them with people who are opposed to the views that dominate the university, which are not those of the founders. And that would start a process of reform. Now, in addition, if there are some extraordinarily wealthy people, and this could only be done by a handful of people in the United States, multi-billionaires who wanted to create new private institutions, they could do so if they were willing to expend large sums and a large portion of their assets on doing so. So that's what I would recommend. In addition, I would recommend that any nominee to the Supreme Court has to state their views on whether human beings have natural rights. The most recent appointee to the Supreme Court was asked that question and said she didn't know. That would have horrified her racial predecessors like Frederick Douglass in the 19th century, whose defense of freedom for everyone and the freedom of slaves was the fact that individuals have rights from nature, and the principal right is the right of self-ownership. So that's what I would say about the trajectory of the country and how the country could be reformed. It would not happen overnight.
Well, this is the same Supreme Court nominee and now justice who couldn't define what a woman was, or what a woman is. So, I'm not.
Right.
Yeah, it's absolutely crazy. Now, one of the things we haven't really touched on is this trans movement that the left is pushing right now. Do you see that as tying all the way back to this influx of German professors?
No, well, yes, actually, because here's what you have to understand. People who are attracted to that view, view of the Germans, there are other views. Any view that has to do with autocracy, it needs a pretext for the aspiring autocrat. He needs a pretext. It can't be, I want power over all of you, and I want to be able to rule without restrictions. That's what I want, and give it to me. No, they have to say there will be some benefit to you, a major benefit to you, if I am given the powers of governing that I need to achieve those. And so there have been a whole series of them. Up until the 18th century, they were all theological. They were all religious. After the 18th century and during the 18th century, they became secular. And so it was the workers. We represent the working class. We represent the poor. We represent the environment. We represent the climate. We represent the gays. We represent a particular race. We represent, and so they'll go for anything. They don't really care about any of these people. The idea is they set up a pretext, and the pretext is such that it empowers them to regulate the affairs of others. They don't care about trans. They don't really care about gays. They don't care about any of these people. They care about their own power, their pretexts. And you have to understand something, that just as there are serial rapists, there are serial killers whose motivation the ordinary person cannot possibly understand. No one has an appetite for those things. No normal person does. Well, no normal person has an appetite for unfettered regulation of the affairs of others. Therefore, you have to find some pretext and say, what I'm doing is for the benefit of others. It's out of the kindness of my heart that I should have transferred to me unregulated powers so that I can fight for the climate, I can fight for trans, I can fight for a race, I can fight for the workers, I can fight for, etc. Most people don't understand that. So they spend their time trying to show that socialism can't work and it doesn't work for the workers, capitalism does, etc. And that's fine, but you have to understand what motivates these people. You have to understand what motivated Marx and Engels. You have to understand what motivated Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels. You have to understand what animates these people, and that's true for the major figures in the Democratic Party as well. All aspiring autocrats, that's it. You don't do the things they've done you don't enable Iran to acquire nuclear weapons that threaten the country. You don't allow the border to be opened up for anyone to get in. You don't allow any of these things. You don't say that you're going to let the Trump tax cuts expire so your taxes will go up. And then in addition to that, you're going to raise taxes again, and you're going to increase capital gains tax, and perhaps you will tax unrealized capital gains. That has to do with the appetites of these people. They will not suffer as a result, just as Stalin didn't suffer as a result. He had about 20 estates that he lived on. I've seen some of them. They're color movies of the estates that he had. He didn't suffer. It was the Russian people and Ukrainian people, et cetera, who experienced famines and the deaths of tens of millions of Russians, just as there were the deaths of tens of millions Chinese under Mao. And the pretext for all this, that they represented the workers, that was an excuse for their own autocratic appetites. And I'll tell you how you can know this. Take Lenin. Lenin led a coup d'etat in Russia in October 1917 and initiated the most extreme version of socialism that has ever been imposed. There was no money. In addition to being no private businesses, he eliminated money. From 1917 to 1922, the Russian economy went into the tanks. Millions of people died from famine, et cetera. They had to exchange goods. They had to barter in the middle of the night to get anything to eat and so on. And by 1922, Lenin realized what he had done and realized he'd lose power if he continued on this path. And so he reinstated capitalism in 1922 in Russia under the euphemism, the new economic policy. It was just the old economic policy that he brought back. But did he give up one-party autocratic governance? No, he didn't. Just as the Chinese, after Mao's death, when they began to introduce what appeared to be capitalism and private ownership of property into China, give up their power. No, they never gave up their power. They haven't given it up today. It's a fascist regime in China under the rule of the Communist Party. And it's this autocratic appetite which these people have, which drives this. And you needn't bother you needn't waste your time looking at their various pretexts, whether it's the climate or anything else. That's the major thing to understand. They use these. They don't believe in any of them. They don't care about workers. They don't care about the climate, and they don't care about the environment. They don't care about a race or anything else. What they care about is power for themselves.
That's very well summarized. I'm going to ask you a hypothetical question. If you were an advisor to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump actually did win the 2024 election, and he asked you, Jeffrey, what do you think I should make priorities in the first 90 days of my second term? What would you tell him?
Well, the first thing I tell him is to close the border, but I don't have to tell him that. He has to close the border. He has to extract as many of the people who came here and remove them from the country as possible. Second of all, he has to cut taxes as he has promised to do, and he must cut them dramatically. And then he needs to start working on removing the bureaucratic agencies or reducing them in size and power. Finally, he's going to have to deal with the problem of Iran. Iran's a serious problem because they basically, at this point, they have enough uranium that's been refined to use for 3 ballistic missiles. And they have intercontinental ballistic missiles, so they can attack the United States. He has to reimpose all the sanctions which Biden removed from Iran. He has to starve them. And my suspicion is with Biden, and I can't confirm this, my suspicion is that it was China who pressured him to remove the sanctions or not enforce the sanctions on Iran, because China gets a large portion of its oil from Iran and are not as dependent upon the United States and Russia as they would otherwise be. And so he has to ignore that. And he's got to basically put them back where they were when he left office, which was a broke autocracy, which doesn't have the money to fund all of these terrorist groups. And then he's going to have to decide what he's going to do about Iran's nuclear capacities. I can't really advise on that. That's not an area of my expertise, but that's a serious problem. Although China has nuclear weapons, and so does Russia. So those are the things that I would say are most important. And then he also has to withdraw all federal funding for universities, whether state or private. And the big private universities with huge endowments have become enormously dependent upon these grants because they get billions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars as well from the federal government, and they have become dependent upon them. And this will begin to affect them. He can't subsidize what are secular churches. They are. They're very invaluable in the sciences and medicine and so on, and engineering, computer science, etc. All of that area, architecture and so on. But they are malign in the areas of the social sciences and the humanities. Are there exceptions? Yes, there are exceptions, but there are not large pools of natural rights libertarians in the universities. They are there, they have been there, but they're a tiny minority. And there are more of them, let's say, in economics than there are in the other disciplines. But those institutions have to be reformed because they educate so many people and they create the political environment of each one of these institutions that affect all the rest of the disciplines, and then, of course, primarily affect all these undergraduates so that you get this culture, affect journalism, the media, everything, the internet, and so on. So that's what I would say it should be his agenda. I would also like to see him explore this tax proposal that I've made. I'm not saying he should propose it, but he should investigate it and try to make it into a popular discussion and a discussion by professionals in the area of taxation.
The name of the book is Winning America's Second Civil War by Jeffrey Paul. Jeffrey, I want to thank you for being here today. This has been very enlightening. The book was very enlightening, and I think you're giving us some straight-up advice at a time when our country really, really needs it. I'm assuming it's available wherever good books are sold?
Yes, it's available. You get it online from any of the Amazon, Barnes & Noble, you name it, Thrift Books, Target, all of them carry it.
Okay, and I assume that you're available for speaking engagements as well?
Absolutely.
And they can contact you through the University of West Virginia?
You can contact me there. I'm having some problems with my email there.
Oh.
They can contact me there, or they can contact me I live in Cincinnati because I'm a research professor. I don't teach, basically. I'm just doing research there. So they can contact me through my email, which is jeffreyjp6@aol.com.
Very good.
And
well, I appreciate you being here today. Like I said, it was very, very enlightening. You've touched on some things that I haven't seen anyone else touch on, and I interview a few authors a week, so I can tell you this is good stuff, and I would encourage everyone to get the book. Once again, Winning America's Second Civil War by Jeffrey Paul. Jeffrey, thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, Mark, for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Have a great rest of the day, sir.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Tea Party Power Hour with Mark Gillar.